The judge, every time I go to court, doesn't like me. Remember today, we're here because someone died. Now, what does he got to say that for? He's just a mean son of a bitch who doesn't like me.
Before February 3rd, 2003, I'd always thought of Phil Spector as the amazing wall of sound guy who could do no wrong. The wall of sound was a dense orchestral aesthetic that sounded really good in radios, jukeboxes, and on record players. Phil was a genius. He was this magical producer who worked with everybody from the Ronnets to John Lennon, creating an incredible, thick, luxurious sound. Many fans of this sound refer to it as Wagnerian. Wagner meets pop music. Symphonies for the kids, he called it. Spector saw pop music as art and brought an aesthetic sensibility to it. His productions were dense and orchestral, layers upon layers of horns, keyboards and strings, percussion, many instruments playing the same note at the same time. However, on that night in February, everything changed. That was the night that 40-year-old B-movie actress Lana Clarkson ended up dead on the floor of Phil Spector's mansion, and Phil's reputation was smashed to smithereens.
My name is Steven, and welcome to Musical True Crime.
Welcome to Musical True Crime.
Be sure to smash that subscribe button and ding the notification bell so you'll be able to see our videos before your piece of shit mailman does.
He brings you nothing but bills anyway, so mailman, come on. Don't forget to watch till the end to find out how truly dark and twisted Phil Spector turned out to be.
West Hollywood is where the celebrities live. Most of the celebrities. It is home to the Sunset Strip and also considered one of the most prominent gay villages in the United States. It was claimed in the late 18th century when Portuguese explorer João Rodrigues Cabrillo arrived and claimed it for Spain. The city used to be called Sherman as it was established by Moses Sherman and his partners of the Los Angeles Pacific Railroad. Movie makers were attracted to the city, and because of this, architecturally distinctive apartment buildings and hotels were built. A slew of Russian Jews moved to West Hollywood in 2 immigration waves after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1978 and 1988. It is also where our story takes place. Lana Clarkson was born in April 5th, 1962 to Donna and James Clarkson. She was raised in Sonoma County, California. After her father passed away in 1978, her family moved to the San Fernando Valley region of Los Angeles. When they moved to Los Angeles County, she pursued a career in entertainment as a performer and model. Her goal was to be a celebrated actress, and she thought the route to that would be through B-movies. However, before she became the cult femme fatale of sword and sorcery films, she actually seemed to be on her way to being a mainstream actress. She made her big screen debut as a minor character in Fast Times at Ridgemont High in 1982, directed by Amy Heckerling. She played the wife of science teacher Mr. Vargas. On a side note, let's not forget Mr. Hand. If you liked Mr. Hand, feel free to give this video a like.
My name is Mr. Hand.
This was a movie that also launched the careers of Sean Penn and Jennifer Jason Leigh, not to mention good old Judge Reinhold.
Mister, if you don't shut up, I'm gonna kick 100% of your ass!
She also appeared in Scarface in a very brief scene in the Babylon Club, dancing behind Michelle Pfeiffer. Whatever happened to Michelle Pfeiffer anyway?
If you know her whereabouts, feel free to comment in the frickin' comments. Let us know.
This is when her career took a detour and she became a B-movie queen. She did 5 feature films for the notorious Roger Corman, beginning with his fantasy film Deathstalker. As a brief side note, I discovered Roger Corman through my uncle David. Both of us being fans of beat literature, he told me about Corman's black and white horror film, Bucket of Blood, as it featured very cliché beatnik characters. However, this was long before Lana's time working with him. Her first collaboration with Corman led to Barbarian Queen and its sequel, which was the first of her sword and sorcery films. In 1987, she was in John Landis's spoof film, Amazon Women on the Moon,
Which I saw as an impressionable teenager. God, that film had my teenage hormones raging.
But I digress. Lana loved her life at the time. Many people saw B-movies as a way to break into mainstream roles, so she relished her time on the screen playing very sexualized characters, baring her breasts, swinging swords, and being every teenage boy's wet dream. A strong, independent woman. She was conventionally beautiful, tall, blonde, curvy, and confident. She would appear in B-movie conventions and comic book conventions. She was definitely an icon in the B-movie sword and sorcery genre. She never broke into the mainstream, but she was a low-key celeb. She was also in horror films and thrillers. She played a lot of small roles and extras in TV shows. She did commercials and she modeled. And the cool thing about her modeling career is that it took her all over the world. Japan, Greece, Argentina, Italy, Switzerland, France, Jamaica, and Mexico. Despite her thriving B-movie career, she also did charity work for AIDS organizations, which earned her a lot of good karma points. Her friends and family were worried for her, however, because AIDS at this time was seen as a very scary and terrifying disease. This was long before people discovered they could actually live long, full lives with the disease, thanks to modern medical technology.
But we all know how the film industry works if you're an actress. Unless you're Meryl Streep or Susan Sarandon, when you hit your 30s or 40s, there's a good chance you're going to be edged out by younger, hotter actresses. Have you ever been edged out by younger, hotter actresses? If so, leave your comment in the frickin' comments.
And if you haven't made it into the mainstream by middle age, you're fucked. There's a very, very slim chance you ever will. This is what happened to Lana Clarkson. She hit her 30s, but she still craved the limelight. She loved being an actress. So she made her own fan website where her fans could come and hang out, chat with her, and order merch. She sold signed copies of her movies and made some coin. But something was off. Lana had lost a little bit of her spark. She wanted the fame, the big roles, the lights, camera, and the action. She felt like she'd been demoted.
All right, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up.
But despite all of this, she refused to give up.
She was still a bright, charming, and affable young woman. Even her friends said that when she walked into a room, she would light it up. Even if the light bulb was burnt out, when she walked into a room, it would brighten up like the brightest sun on the brightest day. And that's pretty bright.
She thought about being a stand-up comic, but she realized she was too hot to be a stand-up comic. Stand-up comics are generally not model material, let's face it. Looking at her gorgeous face in the mirror, she threw away the routines she'd written. And by this point, less and less people were visiting her website and buying her movies. She was hitting a low point. Then she had an idea. She needed to get close to the movers and shakers. She needed a job that would connect her to the big wigs. So she got a job at Dan Aykroyd's restaurant, House of Blues. House of Blues was where John Candy, Alanis Morissette, and so many other big names would hobnob. So Lana became the hostess with the mostess. She'd greet people, let them in, smile, and make them feel at home. And to be fair, this wasn't even the House of Blues itself, but the VIP lounge, the foundation room. A special place for special people. But little did she know that this job was the last job she would ever get. A few weeks into her job, a woman came in. She was a mousy woman, 5'4", with long, stringy, greasy hair. She tried to walk in without being meted and greeted by Lana, so Lana stopped her. "Sorry, Miss Spector." Phil was incensed. "Miss? Young lady, I'm not a miss. I'm Mr. Phil Spector, the famous producer who coined the term wall of sound. Have you not heard of me? Do you know who I am? I am the wall of sound. How dare you? Why, you rotten little..."
The reason why she assumed Phil was Phyllis, in her mind, was because with his long curly wig, he looked a bit like a middle-aged woman. You know, the kind of woman who
darns socks and has 17 cats. So she apologized profusely, showing him to a table and brought him a drink. He was with a date. It was an old friend of his from back in the day, but she was off the sauce. She wasn't drinking alcohol, so she ordered a water. Phil was not impressed. You don't take someone to the foundation room and drink H2O. That is patently absurd. See, rumor has it Phil had been off the booze for 3 years before this fateful evening, but at 7 p.m. he decided to go to town. He visited a clutch of Hollywood haunts, Trader Vic's and Dantana's, and imbibed a huge amount of Navy grog, 150 proof tequila, and shared his time with 2 dates before ending up at House of Blues. Apparently, he knew that alcohol is not his best friend, and he had tried to keep it at bay, but on this February evening, he chose to fall off the wagon. And fall he did. If you know you have an addiction that brings out the worst in you, and yet you don't seek help to fix it, you're putting yourself and others at risk. I mean, everything in moderation, right? Don't tempt fate. But on February 3rd, 2003, Phil Spector did tempt fate, and fate bit him in the arse. Phil Spector had a rough childhood. He was born on December 26, 1939, into a Jewish family in the Bronx, New York. So he was a Christmas baby, pretty much, like Jess. I mean, that's a tragedy in itself, isn't it? Everyone's just like, yes, I'll give him one gift and that'll cover both Christmas and his birthday. It creates some built-in resentment. The Bronx is east of Manhattan, across the Harlem River, and north of New York City borough of Queens. The word Bronx comes from Jonas Bronk, who established the first settlement of the New Netherland colony in 1639. The South Bronx was also a center of piano manufacturing in the early 20th century, with 63 piano factories employing 5,000 workers.
Benjamin and Bertha Spector were of Russian descent. Benjamin was an iron worker. The last name was originally Spectrus, but they anglicized it to Spector so they would fit in and be part of the cool kids club.
Phil, who was originally named Harvey Phil Spector, was a normal, extroverted kid. But in 1949, his father stopped the car a few blocks from his home, attached a water hose to the exhaust pipe, and dangled the other end through the front window. Benjamin Spector passed away from carbon monoxide poisoning. The families felt shame. They'd moved to America for a good life, and this besmirched the family name. Not only that, but Spector was shaken to the core. He carried the loss of his dad for his whole life. It provided him with both the ambition to succeed, but also the deep feelings of insecurity and loneliness. He became a shell of his former self. He changed his name to Phil, became withdrawn, and started playing guitar in his room late at night. After Benjamin's passing and when little Philly Poo was 12 years old, Bertha took the family to L.A. She wanted to get away from the memories of the tragedy and work as a seamstress. She traveled from their home in West Hollywood to L.A. every single day to work her fingers to the bone. Tensions at home escalated.
Phil felt smothered by his mother and sister. His sister was basically a mini version of her mother. When Phil began dating, his mother and sister began acting irrationally jealous and possessive, like they were jealous lovers. Phil's sister eventually ended up in and out of mental institutions. Phil blamed them both for his father's death. He resented them and he didn't give them a lot of love. Nevertheless, Bertha encouraged Phil to buy a guitar for his bar mitzvah, and then she took him to Ella Fitzgerald, which changed his life.
He was hooked. Music was his drug. High school was rough. He was an outsider. Journalist Mick Jones said he was the little nerd that nobody wanted to play with, but his gift of music allowed him to redefine who he was. He started the Teddy Bears with a couple of high school pals. He co-wrote the tunes and performed on guitar and vocals. In 1958, they recorded Don't You Worry, My Little Pet, and signed a 2 or 3 singles deal with Era Records. Then the unthinkable happened. To Know Him Is to Love Him shot to #1 on the newly formed Billboard Hot 100 singles chart on December 1st, 1958.
Bear in mind, Phil was only 17 when this ditty went to the top of the charts. This little dude was a musical prodigy. Think about it. He picked up his guitar, and 2 years later, he had a smash hit. And he was still a pimply-faced teenager. I'm just kidding. He had pretty clear skin. They called him the first tycoon of teen.
He was considered the first auteur of the music industry for the unprecedented control he had over every single phase of the recording process. The record went gold, and the Teddy Bears performed on American Bandstand. They were gaining traction, but it wasn't meant to be. Subsequent singles didn't sell, and a year after the band formed, they split up. The lead singer, Annette Kleinbard, was in a horrific car accident in 1960 which hastened the band's demise. Fun fact, Annette Kleinbard changed her name to Carol Connors and ended up co-writing the theme song to Rocky.
Wish me luck, I'm gonna need it.
Now, before you start bemoaning the fact that the Teddy Bears split up and, oh my god, they split up, how am I gonna survive? Bear in mind, that was over 60 years ago, so cool down. Not only that, but these kids were kids. They were teenagers. They were like 18 or 19. They had bigger plans in life. They had other fish to fry.
Spector himself had plans to study at UCLA, which he did, and he worked as a court stenographer to pay tuition, which is ironic when you hear the rest of the story. And let's face it, Spector was not made for performing. Not only that, but he had crippling stage fright. He wanted to get his mitts dirty. He wanted to sprinkle his magic fairy dust all over the mixing board and make some gold records. And he did just that. He began writing and co-writing hit songs, and in 1961 formed Phyllis Records. Phyllis was a combination of the first names of its 2 founders, Phil Spector and Lester Sill. However, in 1962, at 21, Spector bought out Lester and was the sole owner of the label. He became the youngest record label owner of all time. Then he lucked out and he signed the Crystals. The Crystals had a string of hits, including Da Do Ron Ron, which apparently some gym teachers use for fitness training. Da Do Run Run Run. I kid you not. Another fun fact, their first hit, the gospel-influenced There's No Other Like My Baby, was recorded on their prom night. Barbara Alston, Mary Thomas, and Myrna Garoud went to school together, and they were wearing their prom dresses in the studio because they went to the studio on their prom night late in the night to record the track.
Now that is dedication to your craft, if you ask me. So here's a brief list of Phil's accomplishments.
He produced the Ronnets, the Crystals, Ike and Tina Turner, the The Beatles' Let It Be, several solo albums by John Lennon, including Imagine, and George Harrison, the Rightous Brothers' You've Lost That Lovin' Feelin', the Beatles' Long and Winding Road, Harrison's My Sweet Lord, Leonard Cohen's Death of a Ladies' Man, the Ramones' End of the Century.
The list is endless. Spector is one in a small handful of producers who had hits in 3 decades, 50s, 60s, and the 70s. The other ones on the list include
Quincy Jones, George Martin, Michael O'Martian, and Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis. So at 21 years old, Phil Spector was a millionaire. But this is a perfect example of blowing your load too soon. The bulk of his successes happened when P.S. was in his early 20s.
Young, dumb, and full of cum. Young, dumb, and full of hot, steaming cum. That was Phil Spector.
Because after that, when he was yesterday's news with lots of money, fame, and gold records, things got a little loopy, as you'll soon discover. So at this point, after amassing so many riches, Phil bought a castle. Well, he called it a castle. It wasn't literally a castle, to be fair. 11 bedrooms, 33 rooms, 8,600 square feet. But the problem was, who would stay in these rooms? He hadn't made a ton of friends. In fact, he had very few friends. His only real connections were music industry people. He hadn't learned how to make real friends. But he did make one friend. Her name was Ronnie. Ronnie was from Spanish Harlem, and she was the lead singer of the Ronnets. The Ronnets had been struggling to make it big for a few years without much success.
They were working as dancers and they were aching for a big break. So in 1963, Ronnie's sister cold called Phil Spector and arranged to meet him. Phil was busy with the Crystals, but when he took them into the studio, he was so impressed with how Ronnie's voice worked with his wall of sound technique that he signed them on the spot.
The vibe of the Ronnets was described as bad girls listening to hard rock. This is all fine and dandy for the Ronnets, but the Crystals were starting to feel left out. Spector focused much more time on this new bad girl band, and despite the Crystals' string of hit singles,
they didn't feel appreciated, and they definitely felt unappreciated when the Ronnets replaced the Crystals on 4 album tracks on the compilation LP, The Crystals Sing the Greatest Hits. The album is called The Crystals Sing the Greatest Hits, and 4 of the songs aren't even the Crystals. I mean, that's kind of fucked up, if you ask me. It's a major diss.
The Crystals also felt that Spector was withholding royalty cash from them. My gut feeling is he probably was. They had 2 more singles that did poorly and then stopped working with that paranoid douchebag Wunderkind. Ronnie from the Ronnets and Phil fell in love. She was impressed with his ability to tell grown men with kids what to do in the studio. She found that kind of hot, so she fell for him. At the time, the Ronnets were touring with the Beatles and kicking ass, but things started to decline.
In 1966, the Ronnets broke up. Done. Finito. It upsets me to this day. Just kidding, it doesn't. I didn't even know them until recently.
Spector turned his attention towards the Rightous Brothers, and Phyllis Records had their 3rd #1 hit with You've Lost That Lovin' Feelin'. But when Ike and Tina Turner's song River Deep, Mountain High stalled at 88 on the Billboard 100, a bitter Phil Spector secluded himself in his Hollywood mansion for 2 years, popping up as a drug dealer in Easy Rider, which is the same year that Ronnie and Philoroni tied the knot.
Marriage is supposed to be a time of bliss and happiness, but when these two took the plunge, Phil was already in a state of despair about his career and his future. He started drinking heavily and fell into a deep depression. He also started showing symptoms of bipolar disorder.
Now, if we want to understand what happened on the night of February 3rd, 2003 with Lana Clarkson, we need to dive into what happened with Ronnie Spector. Now, first off, she had to hide in the bathroom on their wedding day because Phil was smash drunk and wanting to argue about money. He accused her of marrying him for his cash and not his heart and soul. Bitter and jealous, he held her hostage in her own home. The doors were locked from the inside, and if I wanted to go out, I'd have to ask him, "Can I go outside?" The way she described it was a happy marriage for a year until I realized I was in a maximum security lockup. She declined touring with the Beatles so she could marry Phil and make albums, but once they were married, Phil took singing away from me, and it was devastating because I had no idea that I would never record again, she told the Rolling Stone in 2016. Quote, "I was in prison in the mansion and I couldn't even get out. For 7 years, I didn't go anywhere," end quote. He pulled guns on her as a scare tactic. She couldn't wear her shoes for fear she'd run away, and he kept a giant gold coffin with a glass top in the living room, and if she threatened to leave, he would point to the coffin and say, quote, "Try it, and you'll end up in there," end quote. They also adopted a mixed-race child named Dante, but Phil treated him in the same way. He'd lock him up in his room even if he had to go to the little boy's room. One year, he even adopted 2 boys as a Christmas present for Ronnie without asking her if she wanted them. This was just a tactic to keep Ronnie in the house with him.
He also allegedly forced his kids to engage in sex acts with his girlfriends.
That's pretty frickin' sick if you ask me.
However, one day in 1972, she mustered up the courage and escaped Phil's golden cage with her mother in tow. Ronnie Spector was always in her bare feet when she was in Phil's house. The reason why was because Phil was keeping her shoes away from her because he didn't want her to leave. That's how controlling and possessive this guy was. Her mother had asked them if she could leave. She said, "Look, my daughter needs a little bit of sun. She needs some vitamin D." After she took off in her bare feet, she thought she was free. But Phil called her and told her that there would be 6 hitmen in the audience of her next performance. He said he would give $1 million bonus to the person who finished the job. Now, Ronnie, in these years, had become an alcoholic because drinking was the only way she could deal with her situation living with Phil. So the night of her performance, she was too drunk to even go on stage. Who knows what would have happened if she had actually made it to the stage? Or if it was just an idle threat. We don't know.
Speaking of guns, Phil was a gun nut. He pulled them out on his girlfriends, musicians, and fellow producers. He shot at the ceiling of the studio, and John Lennon asked him to save his poor ears. He kept the Ramones hostage in the studio during difficult recording sessions. He bought his first gun during his teddy bear days because he knew he was small and felt powerless. However, in time, whether it was his undiagnosed bipolar disorder or a short man's complex, firearms became his best friend and a way for him to feel like a real man.
And as you'll see, this love of guns is what led to Phil's downfall.
Spector had formed a new record company with Warner Brothers and was hoping to climb his way back to the charts when he was almost killed in an accident in 1974. Phil had a horrific car accident and plummeted through his windscreen, sustaining serious head injuries. They required literally thousands of stitches, and the accident propelled him to retreat from the public eye once again for a very long time. He popped up and produced Leonard Cohen's Death of a Ladies' Man 3 years later. However, Cohen fans were angered by the dense orchestral sound, describing the album as grotesque.
I gave this album a listen. Personally, I found it haunting, ghoulish, disconcerting, disturbing, terrifying, and creepy. Give Death of a Ladies' Man a whirl, and I think you'll know exactly what I mean. It is the stuff of nightmares. So after producing the Ramones' End of the Century, he pretty much retired. So for the next 2 decades, with the exception of some court battles, especially one in which he had to pay the Ronnets $2.6 million in back royalties, he was pretty much a recluse in his mansion. He said at the time,
quote, "People tell me they idolize me, want to be like me, but I tell them, trust me, you don't want my life," end quote. He said, quote, "I've been a very tortured soul," end quote. This takes us to February 3rd, 2003. 63-year-old Phil and his date sat in the House of Blues. Phil's date left. She felt pressured by Phil to drink, whereas she just wanted a tall glass of water. Dateless, Phil focused his attentions on the hostess, Lana Clarkson. After initially mistaking him for a woman, she bent over backwards to make him happy. She brought him drinks, chatted with him, and treated him like Hollywood gold. He took a shine to her, so when the bar closed up, he invited her back to his castle. She was reluctant, saying it wouldn't be appropriate. "I'm your hostess. Isn't it crossing a line? Plus, you're smash drunk, dude." He told her, quote, "Just for one drink. You seem interesting. I'd like to get to know you on a deeper, more personal level," end quote. The flattery didn't go unnoticed. After much cajoling, she went. They drove back to the castle. 2 hours later, a call came into 911. It was from Adriano de Souza, Spector's Brazilian chauffeur.
911, what are you reporting?
Hi, my name is Adriano. I think my boss killed somebody. Please, can you send me
You think your boss killed somebody?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and your boss's name?
It's Phil Spector.
So the police responded super quick. It's a rich area. It's not a rundown, poor, or black neighborhood, so the police were extra concerned. They arrived and looked at the house, talking about the best strategy. They walked the slight hill up to the front door, 88 steps. Brandon Cardella, who was with the force for 4 years, yanked out his 40-pound police shield. They had to be cautious because they had no idea what they were up against. They turned off the cop lights so as not to attract too much attention to themselves. They noticed a figure in the window pacing back and forth. The figure had long, unkempt, greasy hair. Spector answered the door with his hands in his pockets. The cops asked him to take them out. He would take them out, rambling like a whack job, and then put them back in as though he forgot what they told him to do. He repeatedly put his hands up and then put them back in his pockets. Nothing he said made sense. The cops were baffled. They referred to it as gibberish. Then he said, quote, "Hey guys, this is just crazy. You guys gotta come in and see this," end quote. They looked in past Spector and saw a young woman's legs lying slumped in a chair. She was clearly not a threat, but Philharmonic Orchestra definitely was. Bear in mind, Phil was drunk. I mean, he was absolutely blotto. Remember, he allegedly hadn't drank in 3 years, so he was gonzo. Remember this because later on in his defense, he adamantly claimed he was sober. Newsflash, he wasn't. Anyway, because he wasn't listening to the cops and putting his hands in his pockets, they felt they had no choice but to taser him. So, taser him they did.
However, he was so drunk that the taser had no effect. It basically bounced off him like a pack of playing cards. He kept standing there, drunk and belligerent, hands going in and out of his pockets, like a freak. So Brad and Cardella charged him with a shield and he crumpled to the ground. The cops piled on top of him, and they neutralized the threat. Cardella went inside. Classical music was blasting and filling the whole house. He walked towards the body. She had 0 signs of trauma, and there was a revolver lying beside her left foot. Opposite her, there was an open drawer with a gun holster lying there, empty. He looked down. White things were on the floor. Chiclets? Pieces of ceiling tile? No. They were teeth. Cardella checked her wrist. There was no pulse. Meanwhile, the rest of the coppers took Philly Manilli back to the cop shop and they grilled him. They asked him the usual questions. He said he went out for a couple drinks with a couple different women. He went to the House of Blues, met her, picked her up, and took her back to his pad. They were chilling out when all of a sudden, she just went to his drawer, opened it, magically discovered a gun inside, sat down in the Louis XIV armchair, and blew her head off. However, the way that Spector told the story lacked any sort of empathy or understanding. He was dropping F-bombs like it was Hiroshima. He was flexing and talking about how super connected he was to the higher-ups in the police department. He said things like, "How dare you do this to me?" and the classic, "Do you know who I am?" Just being an all-around douche.
Absolute nonsense. He's a piece of and I don't know what the problem is. If you say you want me right to come to my dad, so blow her head open and say they're murder. What the is wrong with you people? I need to come to my house and run through my house and climbing down like a pig. I need to have somebody dying there, and and then scare the out of everybody like somebody commits suicide.
He talked as though he resented her for what he claimed she did. He acted it out, but in such an exaggerated way that it seemed overdone and, dare I say, made up. But he sobered up and he realized he was ranting like a fucking lunatic and he clammed up. As he waited for his lawyer, he contacted Michelle Blaine, his personal assistant and his only friend. His bail was $1 million. He paid it and he got the hell out. Because his castle was a crime scene, he couldn't stay there, so he and Michelle went into hiding at the Bel Air Motel. Michelle grilled him about what happened, and the only response he had was, quote, "I don't know," end quote, and, quote, "It was an accident," end quote.
Soon after, he was able to go back home, but he stuck to the same story. In fact, he sent out a mass email claiming that what happened was an accidental suicide. And the cops initially thought exactly the same thing. The crime scene seemed to be a suicide at first. Lana might have been depressed. Her dreams hadn't come to fruition. She was relegated to doing comic conventions and selling her DVDs online.
However, after interviewing her friends and family, it became clear she was not at all in a suicidal frame of mind. She saw this year as a new chapter in her life.
It was so upsetting for everybody that loved her and knew her that the things that they were saying about her were so untrue.
The investigators checked out her website for clues. They were surprised to find optimistic statements like, quote, "This is my year," end quote. She even went shopping that day and bought a pair of shoes. Would someone do that if they planned on offing themselves? And what about the manner of death? Blowing your head off in a stranger's house? That's pretty unlikely.
Attractive blondes would be more concerned with leaving a beautiful corpse. They're more likely to down a bottle of pills. Think about it. So the investigators started questioning this suicide hypothesis that Phil Spector was pushing. Why would a non-depressed person kill themselves? It makes zero sense. "Oh, I'm so happy, I'm gonna blow my head off." That's ridiculous. Nobody does that. Happy people, they don't do it, man. Jess, if you were happy, would you blow your head off? No. Exactly. Don't be a dork. They went and interviewed the peeps at House of Blues. Now, don't forget that Lana had just started working there 3 weeks earlier. She was hoping to press some palms and schmooze her way to the top of the Hollywood A-list.
They asked for the surveillance footage, and while they waited for it, they headed back to Spector's castle to have another look. They found a diaper in the garage can. Now, what a diaper is a soft cloth gun owners use to clean their weapons. When they opened it, they saw blood. Then they glanced over and saw the blood on the toilet. It appeared that whoever was in there had tried to clean up the blood. Miss Clarkson, it should be mentioned, had a smudge of blood on her face as though someone had wiped it. The coroner's reports show that there had been sexual contact. DNA was found on one of her breasts, and there was a mixture of their DNA on a glass, suggesting they might have kissed.
Chances are they might have kissed. Maybe a gentle peck or a very short-lived makeout sesh, but Lana probably didn't want to go any further. He wasn't her type, you know. So if she rejected him, would he have been incensed enough to pull the trigger? That's the question. Now, the gun had Lana's DNA on it, for sure, because it was in her mouth, but it didn't seem to have any fingerprints. That made no sense. However, there were bits of blood caught in the crevices, indicating the gun might have been wiped. Also, Lana was right-handed, but the gun was found at her left foot.
If she'd offed herself, it didn't make sense that the gun would be there and not near the right side of her body. And one thing that kept bothering the investigators was, if Lana was going to do herself in, why did she have her purse on her right shoulder? A few feet from the door with her purse on her shoulder suggests that she was on her way out, not on her way to sing with the Heavenly Choir of Angels. Who grabs their purse, heads for the door, and then just decides at the last minute to blow their brains out? It makes no sense. They looked at the security footage. They saw a drunk Phil Spector stumble to his car, get inside, and wait. Then they saw Lana leave the club. Then they saw Philly D invite her to the house, but something was off. At the club, he had a very long white jacket, almost an oversized jacket made for a tall man, but when the cops were called to his place, he was all in black. Black shirt, black pants. He was the man in black, as Johnny Cash might say. So they said, fuck it, let's find that goddamn jacket, and find it they did. Then they went back to the castle, and the jacket from the security footage was indeed there, upstairs, hanging up in the closet. Bingo! They examined it closely. They saw tiny speckles. No idea what that was. They took it to the crime lab. By this point, they knew something very fishy was going on. If this is a suicide, my name is Hanna-Barbera, the lead investigator said to himself. Let me assure you, my friends, his name was not Hanna-Barbera. They were more and more sure that Phil Spector killed Lana Clarkson.
The problem was a lack of motive. I mean, why on God's green earth would he do this?
They started getting tips. They traveled around the country to interview people, and once they started digging, they found a ton of dirty secrets. He was controlling. He kept money from his artists. His family has a history of mental illness. The mentally ill sister. His father who killed himself. Phil himself was in therapy and took a host of various pills, psychotropic and otherwise. They acted like psychologists and began digging into his brain. His obsession with guns, his inadequate feelings about his height. He would wear clunky shoes with huge heels and wear big jackets to appear more intimidating. Digging into his gun obsession, they discovered that he had many incidents of pulling out guns, as I mentioned before. He also pulled a gun at the head of a valet parking lot attendant in the Beverly Hills Hotel in broad daylight in front of everyone. He threatened him because he had to wait for his Rolls Royce. Quote, if you ever make me wait this long for my Rolls Royce, I will blow your fucking brains out. End quote. Yeah, Phil knew how to make friends. To Phil, guns equal power. The stories of him holding Ronnie Spector hostage came to light. Other stories came out as well, pulling guns out at women, threatening them. To boot, when he was drunk, it was like Jekyll and Hyde. He became a demon. And many stories of women wanting to leave and Spector holding them captive. Nobody leaves Phil was his motto. The stories were sounding alike. The moment they wanted to leave, Phil would pull out a gun.
Now they knew they had their man. They figured it went like this. Phil went to the House of Blues. He chatted with Lana. They were amused by each other. When she closed up shop, he asked her over. She was reluctant, but he said, let's just be one drink, chill out, I'll get my chauffeur to drive you home afterwards. So she agreed. At his house, they had quite a few more drinks. Phil was most likely hoping that she would let her guard down, but in fact she did not. They kissed. She probably said she didn't want to go any further and wanted to go home. Phil left the room, removed the deadbolt, essentially locking her inside. He left for quite a while. Then he returned, pulled the gun out from the drawer, and then stuck it in her mouth. Who knows why? Who knows what he was thinking when he did this, but he decided to pull the trigger.
But what they needed was a smoking gun. The lab results came back. The blood in the bathroom was Lana's blood. Wait, a woman who blew her head off went to the can? No, didn't happen. No cigar. And the smoking gun, the white jacket, they took into the lab. They found blood spatter on the jacket, and it was Lana Clarkson's blood. They also found her blood in the right-hand pocket, meaning her blood was on his hands, and he put his hand in his pocket. He claimed he was across the room when he saw Lana kill herself. If so, how the hell could he have her blood spatter on his jacket? The blood wouldn't have traveled that far. He had to be in front of her when he ended the poor starlet's life. 7 months after Lana Clarkson's untimely demise, Phildup was handcuffed and charged with her murder. So long, sucker. The world was stunned.
There's a pattern that emerges in Philip Spector's history, and it's a pattern that's indelibly etched into his history. When there's a woman, alcohol, a loss of control, Philip Spector pulls a gun.
It took a grand total of 3 years to bring this gun-obsessed maniac to trial. The case was the biggest televised trial since O.J. Simpson. Spector turned it into a circus, flaunting a variety of different wigs, marrying a much younger woman named Rochelle, talking when his lawyers told him to shut the fuck up, firing lawyer after lawyer. His first lawyer was Robert Shapiro, who was the dude who defended O.J. Simpson. He didn't feel that Mr. Shapiro was invested in the case, so he fired his ass. The second lawyer was Bruce Cutler, who announced in the courtroom that he wouldn't work with Spector because they had different strategies.
There was no crime here. This lady died in Phil's home. There was no crime. And we're anxious to make certain, and our mission is to make certain that we win this case here in this building and in the court of public opinion.
My fingerprints were not on the gun, and that Dr. Henry Lee found no crime scene in my home.
His third lawyer was Linda Kenny Baden, who represented Casey Anthony. Now, you're probably asking yourselves why the heck he went through lawyers like he went through underwear. Well, the answer is simple. Phil Spector, clearly a raging narcissist, if you can't tell, thought his lawyers were dumb as bricks and he was smarter than them.
Ergo, he would sabotage his case. During interviews, when his lawyers were speaking, he would barge in and interrupt them. They advised him to stay silent, but their request made him assume that they were actually working for the cops, and they were against him. They were trying to sabotage him. This disgust with his lawyers led to him coming up with a foolproof plan.
He asked Michelle Blaine to film him making a video that would, in his mind, exonerate him in the eyes of the public, but it did the opposite. He was going to put the video on a website to tell his side of the story. However, it never ended up on a website. First of all, he looked, in Michelle's words, insane. Puka shells and a Hawaii shirt like he's going on safari. Quote, "And this is how you're going to show the world you're innocent?" End quote. In the video, he didn't say Lana's name. He dehumanized her in an effort to distance himself from the crime. He played victim and blamed the police for what happened. He also complains that paramedics didn't show up, even though she was clearly dead half a second after he blew her head off. Making the video clinched it for Michelle Blaine. As Spector was making these absurd, incriminating tapes, D.A. Alan Jackson, the prosecutor in this case, was preparing his case against the music legend. Spector was coming to court surrounded by an entourage of people, lawyers, bodyguards, his wife, and so on. It seemed like a way to say, so many people support me, I'm gonna win. But the physical evidence doesn't lie.
Now, firstly, the gun was clearly in her mouth when the trigger was pulled. She was also back in a prone position, pulling away from the gun. The bruise on the tongue indicates that the gun was clearly pressed into her mouth unwillingly. Phil Spector had a gun in her face and she was backing away. That much is obvious. If you disagree, feel free to leave your comment in the freaking comments. The white jacket with blood spatter, Lana's blood on a door handle, Lana's blood in Phil Spector's pocket. All very convincing evidence, and yet the defense insisted, they continued to insist it was I mean, what were they thinking? People are stupid? People aren't as stupid as you think. Defense?
But Lana Clarkson had never been in the house. How on earth would she know he owned a gun? How on earth would she know it would be in that drawer? That one particular drawer was open. In a huge house with 33 rooms, it was the only drawer open. The things the defense said were simply untrue. They painted her as a floozy who didn't care about anything, and it wasn't true. Let's not forget, she was sitting near the back door with her shoes and jacket on, and the notorious purse hanging off her shoulder. 5 ex-girlfriends and dates took the stands with horrific stories detailing how Spector would pull guns and hold them against their will. They referred to him as demonic and monstrous. These stories happened over the course of 30 years, indicating that this behavior was long-standing. The prosecution's version of events on that February 3rd fit perfectly into this pattern of behavior. And the smoking gun in the trial was the star witness, Spector's long-suffering Brazilian driver, Adriano de Souza. Spector confessed his crime to him that night when he announced, "I think I killed somebody." They thought it was a no-brainer. Guilty verdict, for sure. But oh no, that jury was hung AF. Those dudes and dudettes could not agree. They said there wasn't enough evidence.
It appears that they wanted Phil himself to come right out and say, "Ladies and gentlemen, I did it. Lock me up. I suck. I'm a jerk." In fact, the holdout, an engineer, apparently wanted exactly that. The evidence wasn't enough for him. He wanted a videotape or some concrete proof that she was killed. But you know what, my friends? They didn't give up. The second trial began. So on April 13th, 2009, one of the world's most famous producers, Phil Spector, was found guilty of second-degree murder. Jail wasn't kind to Spector. He was beaten up and 2 of his temporary teeth were knocked out. So, afraid of leaving his cell, he sat there staring at the wall and muttering to himself most of the time. Alone, desperate, sad, and an empty shell of the music mogul he once was. Now, what do you think of Phil Spector? Do you think he was a maniac? Do you think he's guilty? What do you think led him to committing that horrific crime? Do you think we should still praise him for his contributions of yesteryear or just erase him from history? Comment your comment in the friggin' comments. And remember, stay safe out there.